Good evening. Welcome to the presentation of this legal memorandum, which tackles a critical challenge at the intersection of international law and global finance, sanctions, divestment, and the TPNW, analyzing the legal and ethical exposure for financial institutions. Core of our legal inquiry is TPNW Article 1E, which prohibits states parties from assisting, encouraging, or inducing in any way or anyone to engage in any activity prohibited by the treaty. My memorandum concludes that providing financial services to nuclear weapons producers likely falls within this prohibited assistance. But this project itself is unique. I've taken it beyond theory. To test the practical and ethical weight of this divestment norm, I've taken the time to interview 5 students from 3 distinct academic backgrounds: international law, economics, and international business management. Their opinions on fiduciary duty, compliance risk, and global morality will form the heart of our qualitative analysis. Let's get into it, starting with the legal foundation of the memorandum itself.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this discussion. My name is Farrel Ananta Subono, and the focus of my legal memorandum is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the TPNW, and the immense pressure it's placing on global financial sectors. The TPNW's core challenges for banks, pension funds, and investors lie in one short, powerful clause, Article 1E. This article itself prohibits any state parties from assisting, encouraging, or inducing in any way or anyone to engage in nuclear weapons activity. So, the legal consensus, which my memorandum supports, is this clause extends to financial assistance and investments. The key tension for us today is not just about law, but also about finance and ethics. That's why I invited you both here. Can a financial institution ethically profit from an industry that is banned by international treaty? That's the first question. And the second question is, how does the duty of financial institutions to maximize clients' returns clash with the moral responsibility? We'll be talking about morals of global non-maleficence. Today, we have 2 sharp minds from the economics department to debate this from Universitas Airlangga. On one side, you can introduce yourself.
Hello everyone, my name is Ratri Rosadi. I am from the economics department in Universitas Airlangga, and I'm quite interested in international economics, and my study is actually about the effects of geopolitical risk on foreign direct investment, so I will find this memorandum quite interesting to talk about.
Really interesting, quite interesting. So, on the other side, we have, you can introduce yourself.
Hello everyone, my name is Dimas Takira Pinotrianika, and I am economics students batch 2023, and I'm currently studying at Universitas Airlangga, majoring in economics.
Okay, so we have 2 economic students today. It's like a slight discussion / debate. It's quite interesting actually, since I told you both the questions. So, let's start with the heart of the matter itself. My first question, and we can throw off to each other. Does passive investments in nuclear weapons company legally or ethically qualify as assistance under the TPNW? So, my memorandum, just a brief reminder, my memorandum explores the TPNW Article 1E, as I said before, which prohibits states parties from assisting nuclear weapons activity. The legal debate is whether financing counts as assistance. Okay, so Rara, from a moral standpoint, why must financial institutions fully divest themselves?
I think it's quite clear. Assistance means a lot of things, and this obviously includes financing, giving out loans, and obviously these banks, they know what they're doing. They know the harm that you'd be causing and how it affects not only the countries that they stay in, but also the other countries around them. Because my study of them itself is actually about how geopolitical risk affects foreign direct investment, right? And sort of investing in just the nuclear industry itself, or the weapons industry, it's indirectly increasing the geopolitical tension around the world, and this obviously decreases the amount of FDI that goes in a lot of countries, and this will affect not only developed countries but developing countries themselves, and they rely heavily on these investments, and they just make everyone just so morally conscious about how are we actually going to war or not. So I think they are aware of this. So
Well, still same question. We can move on to Dimas. What's your view on this?
I agree on the ethics, but we need financial pragmatism. The pension funds primary legal responsibility is its fiduciary duty, maximizing the return for its beneficiaries. TPNW's prohibition on assistance is intended for direct state support, not passive investment in a global company. Divesting from an entire sector based on treaty our nation hasn't even ratified sacrifice financial security for a moral position that ultimately won't stop production.
Okay, so this is getting interesting. From one side,
It is.
you actually agree on the ethics and the moral standpoint, which is no means no, right?
Yeah, no,
You're,
it's not.
you're saying no
It's
means no.
obvious.
Article 1E says no, which includes financial institutions
Yes.
on their investments on those companies, right? But this is quite interesting. You said you agree on the ethics, but we have to come back. We have to circle back to the financial pragmatism itself. Financial institutions have their duty to maximize their returns for the beneficiaries, right? And so you said that the TPNW's prohibition on assistance is intended for direct state support, but not passive investment in global companies, right? So they're directed in for states, right? So that's what you mean. Well, okay, quite interesting. So moving on, since we all said about risk, all three of us said something about risk. Well, let's talk about risk right now. My memorandum argues that even in non-state parties, which non-state parties are countries that haven't signed or ratified
Yeah.
or does not agree with this treaty, which is America, China, Russia, North Korea, and so
the
on.
big countries, yes.
The big countries, yes. Even in non-state parties, funding nukes or nuclear weapons creates a huge reputational risk and is contrary to ESG standards. ESG standards, your economic students, you certainly
Yes.
know better than me regarding that. So my question is to Dimas. How can a bank ignore ESG principles when public and institutional pressure is clearly pushing for divestment? It's a bit controversial with your statement before.
Okay. Reputational risk is real,
It is.
and ESG is vital. But many defense companies only have small percentage of their business tied to nuclear weapons. We can use an exclusion threshold. Divest only if the nuclear component exceeds, say, 5% of their revenue. Full divestment is an overaction that harms diversification. The bank's main social contribution is providing a secure return, which requires global assets exposure.
So, quite interesting, Dimas. I've seen you've come prepared for my questions. I've seen you have your research also.
Quite.
Interesting. So you're saying we can overcome that within the exclusion threshold, which is, say, 5%. So 5% of the investment that goes to nuclear, just cut off 5%. That's what you mean, right? So, Rara, what do you think about this threshold?
So I guess what Dimas is saying, we shouldn't cut it off completely, but
Entirely, yeah.
entirely. But at this point, I have to disagree because it's a sort of ethical loophole. You know,
I can see that.
because at this point, these banks, they have to abandon any sort of moral compass that they have because they know it's obvious that nuclear weapons, they just bring mass destruction, they just bring all sorts of harms to other countries and every other country. And it's not, at this point, it's not necessary. It's not necessary for banks to even invest in nuclear weapons or the weapons industry because if I'm not mistaken, Norway, they're actually doing really great right now. I mean, they're investing their pension funds in so many other things, but also implementing a full exclusion policy, which just means you don't need to invest in nuclear weapons to get high returns. So I think this is just some sort of logic they're trying to implement to other banks and especially large countries who depend a lot on these wars and conflicts. So I have to disagree again. Yeah.
Really interesting. So I've
Yes.
seen that you've done your research also on this
Research too,
topic.
yeah.
So it's been back and forth for a while between these two sharp minds of economic students. So I think we should conclude it. Okay? So the conclusion is the tension between the ethical idea of the TPNW and the economic reality of itself of the market, as you say. So my question is, one of my last question is, what's the single action should the financial institution take right now? What should we do from a financial standpoint?
Just immediate action. They just need to. They know what we have. We all know what we have to do to stop it. We just. It's pretty obvious the answer, and I think what the countries are doing, they're just delaying what it's inevitable to happen. And before the conflict gets worse, I think it's really, really important for all of these countries to sign the treaty, to make sure conflicts don't spread out as much. And it's important because these money, like a lot of the people who use these banks, they don't even know that their own money is used to fund these nuclear weapons, right? So I think it's really, really important to just immediately do action for these countries. Yes.
So you're saying pro divestment, right?
Yeah.
Full exclusion.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
you're also thinking about the transparency of the bank's clients also.
Yes, of course. Like, why would you want, if you don't know that your money is going to nuclear weapons, why would you invest in those sort of banks? So, yeah, I think it's important.
Quite interesting. Same question for Dimas.
For me, the responsible first step is full transparency and shareholder engagement. Don't immediately divest or lose your influence. Instead, use your shareholder power to pressure the companies to diversity away from nuclear work, while prioritizing the highest feasible return for your clients.
So, also interesting. So, actually, we've concluded that you both have same ideas on full transparency, but you're saying no, we should still stick to Article 1E, which says no assisting at all, even for financial institutions. But
Yeah.
you're saying it's quite fine as long as there's full transparency and shareholder engagement.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, okay. Thank you for your time, Rara and both Dimas. So this debate clearly shows that whether through legal enforcement or market pressure, the financial sector can no longer ignore the TPNW and its demand for a divestment standard. So thank you for your time, guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
So, good evening. Welcome back to our previous discussion. Still with the same topic, the presentation of my legal memorandum titled Sanctions, Divestment, and the TPNW, analyzing the legal and ethical exposure for financial institutions. First, the international legal landscape has fundamentally changed with the entry of force on the TPNW. The question is no longer just about states possessing nuclear weapons, but about the private companies and financial institutions that fund them. So, we're back with a different student, a different sharp mind from a different department to get a better point of view from each view. Not just from the financial view, but from a consumer business view. Same, our focus is the TPNW Article 1E, which prohibits state parties from assisting, encouraging, or inducing in any way or anyone to engage in any activity prohibited by the treaty. Our memorandum analyzes whether bank loans and investment portfolios as a consumer also constitutes this prohibited assistance. But before we move on to our interesting discussion, I'm going to give the time to you to introduce yourself.
Okay, let me introduce myself. My name is Ananta Saputra. I'm a student of UKN Veteran East Java, and I'm studied at management major.
Okay, so your major is business management, right? So it's more of a consumer point of view now. Different to my previous discussion, which you also heard from behind the screens, from the financial point of view. So, from a consumer point of view, as a business owner, I have 3 simple questions for you, okay? The first question is about the moral choice. The question is simple. If a major bank, your bank, the bank that you use, and you have your own pension fund inside that bank, which is making money by investing in nuclear weapon companies. The question is simple. Do you believe they should prioritize profit for the bank and for you, or global peace?
I think we should prioritize peace.
Interesting. Why?
Because making profit from weapons of mass destruction is fundamentally unethical, and it goes against the idea of responsible investments.
Wait, this is quite interesting. As a business owner, as a consumer who prioritizes profits, actually, you don't want to lose money on your investments, right? True. But you're still against the idea that profit from weapons or mass destruction, it goes against the idea of responsible investments, right?
You're right. It's correct.
Okay, so quite interesting. A follow-up question to my first question. The stigma or reputation. The TPNW aims to stigmatize nuclear weapons, making them unacceptable at all costs. As a consumer, if you learned your bank was a major funder of nuclear weapons, would that change your opinion of them?
Absolutely. It's a huge reputational risk. I would look for an ethical bank. They should follow ESG principle or environment, social, and governance. And nuclear weapons are the opposite of social and governance responsibility that I said before.
Okay, so still, then again, this is quite interesting. So your mindset, you're set on ESG principles, which goes on top, underneath responsible investment and over profit. That's quite interesting. So it captures the reputational risk and consumer pressure on yourself, right?
Yes.
Okay, so last question. Simple question. The action. As a business owner, as a CEO, if you were the CEO of a pension fund and your research showed that you could still get good returns, by fact you could get good returns by switching to non-nuclear companies, would you sell your nuclear related investments?
Yes, I'd sell immediately. If the financial return is equal, there's a zero excuse to keep funding weapons that threaten global security. A clear decision, divestment, is necessary.
So it's a non-brainer, right?
No, it's not a brainer at all.
So it's a non-brainer. If you could still get good returns or good profits off of non-nuclear companies, you would sell your nuclear-related investments at the banks that are investing in nuclear weapon companies, right?
Yeah.
All right. So you're quite straightforward to call to action to divestment. So I think that concludes a point of view from a business owner, a consumer of the bank loans, and so on and so on. So, is there anything that you would like to add to my topic or no?
No, I think that's it.
That's enough for me also. So, thank you, Seno. Thank you for your opinion.
Yes.
And good evening. So, good evening. Previously, I've already interviewed 2 economic students and 1 business management students. And to go on with our discussion regarding this analysis, we need to understand the formal legal constraints of the TPNW itself. The core question for my memorandum is the interpretation of Article 1E, which is, does financial investment count as assistance? So, now we're joined by...
Good evening, everybody. My name is Gova Shaifi Al-Ma'arif. I'm a law student from Universitas Airlangga.
Yes, so we're accompanied by Gova, a law student, to explore the legal hurdles in enforcing this. So I have a couple legal questions more complex than before. And my legal memorandum itself, well, to start off, my first question is going to be about the interpretation of assist itself inside the Article 1E. My legal memorandum identifies the meaning of assistance in the TPNW Article 1E as the central legal ambiguity for financial institutions. For lawyers or for jurists, the highest hurdle in proving illegal assistance for a passive investor is establishing causality and intent. Maybe you could help me elaborate on what makes proving the nexus and the mens rea or intention so difficult for financial institutions.
Okay, so the highest hurdles is proving the causality connection and the mental element, which is mens rea, from the financial institution. So for passive investment, it is hard to prove that the bank had knowledge or intentions that its specific action would significantly assist the nuclear programs. So usually this keeps the institutions in non-state parties legally safe.
Interesting. So you're saying that it's really hard to prove that the bank itself had intentions
Yes,
for specific actions that would assist the nuclear program, right?
yes, correct.
That's why it's so difficult to prove that they have the mens rea and the nexus of the financial institutions to provide in the nuclear program. Well, okay, so that's self-explanatory. That explains why financial institutions feel legally safe, but the law isn't static. Even if the TPNW isn't fully binding, its existence is changing global norms. So it connects the ambiguity of interpretation to the growth of norms. Do you agree? Okay. So moving on to my next question, since we're in the context of international law, treaties and so on, we're gonna move on to customary international law, which gets quite interesting. So the divestment norm driven by the TPNW is often described as an emerging customary norm. It's something that's emerging right now in society and in the world as tensions between lots of countries are emerging. So please enlighten me. What specific evidence, the state practice, and the sense of legal obligation, or opinio juris, as we say, is currently driving this transition from a treaty obligation to a potentially binding customary rule, even for non-party states that aren't a party of this treaty itself?
Okay, so yes, referring to opinio juris or
Yes.
emerging norms, the divestment norms is an emerging customary norms. So
Yeah.
the widespread adoption of divestment policies by financial institution and the consistent ethical pressure,
Yeah.
which is state practice and opinio juris, could eventually establish a binding global standards, even for the countries that haven't ratified or is not a signatory parties to the TPNW.
Okay, you're saying it's possible via opinio juris, right?
Yes.
So the divestment norm for non-party states that haven't ratified the TPNW, it's becoming an emergent customary norm,
Yes.
and that customary norm itself will transform into a potentially binding customary rule.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. That is correct.
So that's quite interesting. That clearly outlines how pressure from social norms, from ethical norms, can create law itself. So moving on, this is getting more interesting. Let's talk about the direct legal risk for nations. For the first question, I have a follow-up later. Let's talk about countries that already have ratified the TPNW.
Sure.
So, since financial institutions are private entities itself, mostly of the financial institutions that are providing investments to companies that are developing nuclear weapons, usually they're private entities. So, under what principle of international law, I'm sure you're more than knowledgeable of this state of international law, what principle of international law would a TPNW state party become responsible for, let's say, a local bank's investment in a nuclear weapon company? And what should the state do to meet its due diligence obligation?
Okay, so there are two principles that countries must adopt. The
Okay.
first one is the due diligence,
Yeah.
and the second one is positive obligation. So the state party would be responsible under the principle of due diligence in international law. And I've done a little bit of research
So
regarding
interesting.
TPNW. In Article 5, it is required that states must adopt penal sanction and other measures. So the state has a positive obligation to ensure entities under its jurisdiction must prevent prohibited activities and also regulating its national financial institutions.
Okay, so what you're saying is you're connecting state obligation in the context of direct state obligation to challenge the non-parties.
Yes.
So that covers the direct legal obligation for the TPNW parties, but most of the world's, it gets more interesting, as I said before. Okay, so see this. Most of the world's major financial centers or institutions are in non-party states.
Yes.
Non-party states as in the US, China, Russia, North Korea, and so on. So let's look at the treaty's influence beyond its memberships, beyond the parties, beyond
Signatory
the
parties.
signatory parties.
Yeah.
So, in that context, while given that the TPNW is not universal, it only applies to states that are signatory to the treaty, what is the main legal or normative challenge the treaty successfully poses to non-party nuclear states? Let's say US, the UK, China, Russia, and their financial institutions. Is it primarily a legal risk or something else? Enlighten me, please.
Okay, so the main challenge is the legitimacy gap. While the TPNW doesn't legally bind them, it is strengthening and it is strengthening the global moral and social norm that nuclear weapons are immoral and illegal. So their financial institution will face severe reputational risk, and the non-party state itself will face growing diplomatic pressure and isolation in forums such as like the UN General Assembly.
So you're getting more political now
Yes,
at the
yes,
end of this question. So you're saying it's quite tricky because there's a diplomatic risk, right?
Yes.
The main challenge is the diplomatic risk for parties that aren't signatory parties to the TPNW. It's more over like they can't do anything because the challenge is they're not parties to the TPNW itself. Well, thank you, Gofa. This demonstrates that while the legal liability of passive investors is a complex challenge, the positive obligation on state parties is clear. We've got that clear. And the TPNW is successfully creating a binding global norm for non-state parties that financial institutions can no longer ignore.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Gofa, for your time, and
You're welcome.
thank you.
Thank you.
So, coming back to our final segment, we're returning to international law to look at compliance and enforcement. Our previous law interview with Gofa focused on interpreting Article 1E and the difficulty of defining assistance itself. In this final interview, I'm accompanied with
My name is Rilo Hanindio. I'm a law student from Airlangga University.
another sharp mind from the law department, and we will focus on the practical legal mechanisms the TPNW creates and how it compares to older treaties. So, a little disclaimer: we've already discussed this behind camera for an hour or two regarding the TPNW and the NPT, and it was quite interesting. To be honest, the discussion was quite tricky. So we'll make it short. Then again, same topic, same focus. We have 3 questions for you today. Moving on, the first question is already quite interesting. It was the TPNW versus the NPT, the clear challenge, right? The NPT says states should negotiate disarmament, but the TPNW says non-nuclear states must eliminate and ban all related activity. Quite simple question. What is the single biggest legal difference between these 2 treaties for a non-nuclear country?
So I think, as what we have discussed before behind the camera, the simplest single biggest legal difference is that it is completely banned. The TPNW moves the legal bar from a vague obligation negotiate to clear mandatory prohibition on all activity. The TPNW makes the entire weapon systems illegal under international law for its members. So that clarifies the mandatory nature of the TPNW itself.
So, the single biggest legal difference is only it moves the NPT from only an obligation to something more as a complete ban, a prohibition on all activity, including financial activity also.
Of course.
Totally agree. It's quite self-explanatory at this point, right? Moving on, a little bit more interesting is regarding clear enforcement mechanism or domestic law, as we discussed before. So, we've discussed that TPNW requires state parties to adopt appropriate legal, administrative, and other measures. That's inside the article, right? Tell me, Rilo, what is the simplest, the most direct legal tool a state party can use to force a domestic bank to divest?
I think the simplest legal tool for a state party to force a domestic bank into divest is by criminal penalties. The state just needs to pass the new national law that says the financing nuclear weapons is a crime. This creates penal sanctions, meaning banks faces fines or jail time for executive if they violate the national implementation of law. It turns an international treaty into domestic mandatory compliance. It's basically like that. I think criminal penalties is the most simplest thing for a simple tool for a state party to force a domestic bank into a divest.
Well, I agree. It seems effective. That's the most effective way, right? Criminal penalties, but as you know, it's easier said than done, though, right? Yes, So the conclusion is it's enforced through domestic penalties. But moving on, it's a follow-up question to the last question. But what if a bank is a global company but is based in a country that opposes the TPNW? So that's quite tricky, right? So, for example, a bank with a branch in a TPNW country like New Zealand, for example, like New Zealand has to follow New Zealand law, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, does this mean a TPNW country can legally force a global bank to change its policy worldwide just to keep one small branch open?
It's yes.
Yeah.
But it must follow the jurisdictional risk.
Okay.
They won't force the whole world to change
Of course not,
properly,
yeah.
because but however they force the bank to choose. The bank will often adopt the strictest policy globally to avoid fines, legal conflicts, and compliance headaches in TPNW country.
Of course.
It creates a domino effects across the corporation itself. So I think it is fine, but via jurisdictional risk.
Yeah.
But choosing the strictest policy.
So it's more like they'll force the bank to choose. Not they won't force the whole world to change
Yeah, of course.
their policies worldwide, right?
Uh-huh.
I don't think that's possible, right?
It's harder that way if
it's
you want to
tricky.
change
Yeah,
everything.
It's trickier. I totally agree. So this concludes our interview. Actually, thank you, Rilo. This
Thank you so much.
confirms that the TPNW is not just a symbolic document. It's not just a treaty that you make and you move over, right?
Yeah,
It
of course.
possesses clear mechanisms to be implemented domestically through penal legislation, which creates mandatory extraterritorial compliance changes and challenges for multinational financial institutions. So, Rilo, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
This concludes our legal analysis, and good evening. The synthesis of our interview across law, economics, and business management is clear. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has fundamentally and irreversibly redefined risk in the financial sector. Our law interviews confirm that while proving direct assistance is difficult, the obligation on TPNW states to implement penal sanctions is mandatory, creating clear legal exposure for banks in those jurisdictions. The economic debate established that the defense of fiduciary duty is now secondary to managing reputational risk. Funding nuclear weapons is inconsistent with modern ESG principles and is no longer a financially justifiable position. The business perspective highlighted the real-world compliance problem. Extraterritorial risk forces global banks to often adopt the strictest TPNW compliant policy worldwide to avoid legal chaos. My final recommendation is the evidence is overwhelming. Failure to divest is an acceptance of unnecessary legal, ethical, and market risk. Therefore, the final recommendation to the pension fund or banks is to immediately adopt a comprehensive nuclear weapons exclusion policy for all investments and financial services. This action is essential to ensure long-term stability and compliance with the future of global finance. This is all from my legal memorandum, and thank you.